You've heard the number, 10,000 hours. Put in 10,000 hours and you master anything. Everyone quotes it like it's science. Here's the thing. The man whose research that number came from spent the rest of his career trying to take it back. Bill Gates didn't get rich because he worked harder than everyone else. He got rich because he was born in 1955 in Seattle and had access to a computer terminal in 1968 when almost no teenager on Earth did. The best hockey players in Canada aren't the most talented kids. They're the ones born in January. And a plane crashed into a hill in New York, killing 73 people, not because of a mechanical failure, but because the first officer was too polite to tell his captain they were out of fuel. Stick with me, because by the end of this, you're gonna look at every successful person you know completely differently, including yourself. Today, we're tearing down a myth. The self-made billionaire, the lone genius, the isolated superstar who just grinds it out alone. That story is comforting. It tells us that if you just work harder than the next guy, the universe rewards you. But the moment you start cross-referencing that story with the actual data, the idea of pure individual merit starts looking incredibly fragile. It shatters, and to see how it falls apart, we have to look at something as mundane as a calendar, a literal paper calendar. Think about how you usually watch sports. You see a professional athlete, and your natural assumption is this person must be one of the most gifted individuals on earth, born with rare talent, then outworked everyone. That is exactly the assumption Malcolm Gladwell's book Outliers subverts right out of the gate, starting with the Canadian Junior Hockey League. In Canada, the cutoff date for age-class hockey eligibility is January 1st. Sounds like the most boring administrative detail imaginable, just a paperwork date, until you look at what that actually means for a growing child. A kid born on January 2nd is playing in the exact same age bracket as a kid born on December 31st of that same year. They are nearly a full year apart in age. And at 9 years old, a 12-month gap is a massive, undeniable physical advantage. Think about a 9-year-old standing next to an 8-year-old, night and day. The kid born in January is taller, heavier, faster, more coordinated. Not because of talent, simply because he's been alive 20% longer. And this shows up in the numbers in a way that's almost eerie. Look at the roster of the 2007 Medicine Hat Tigers, an elite junior team, the kind of pipeline that feeds the NHL. Out of the 25 players on that roster, 17 were born in January, February, March, or April. 17 out of 25, and it wasn't a fluke. Canadian psychologist Roger Barnsley documented this pattern and called it the relative age effect. In almost any elite group of hockey players, 40% were born in the first quarter of the year, only 10% in the last quarter. And it isn't just Canadian hockey. Look at the 2007 Czech national junior soccer team, a squad that made the World Cup finals. Same exact pattern. Nearly every player had an early birthday. Now here's the part that actually matters. By the time these players are 20, a 1-year age gap means nothing physically. So how does a slightly bigger 9-year-old turn into a professional athlete a decade later? This is where sociologist Robert Merton's idea comes in, the Matthew effect, named after the biblical verse, "For unto everyone that hath shall be given, and he shall have abundance. To those who have more will be given, the rich get richer." Or in this case, the slightly older get much, much better. It's a cumulative advantage. At age 9, coaches run tryouts. They look at the kids on the ice and see the bigger, faster, January-born kids. And the coach doesn't think this child is older. The coach thinks this child is talented. They confuse physical maturity with innate ability, then pick the bigger kids for the elite traveling teams. And what happens when you make the elite team? You get the best coaching. Twice as much ice time, practicing 3 times a week instead of once, tougher competition. Over 5 or 6 years, that higher quality, higher intensity practice actually forges them into genuinely superior players. By 14, the January kid really is better than the December kid. But the original advantage wasn't talent, it was a paperwork date that the system quietly turned into a real permanent gap in skill. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. Picture 2 identical seeds. Give one a month's head start in the sun. By the time the second seed goes into the ground, the first one is already sprouting. Look at that and you'd swear the first plant is genetically superior, so you put it in the premium greenhouse with the expensive fertilizer. The second one gets left outside in the shade. Of course, the first one grows bigger. You manufactured that superiority. And if you're a parent listening to this, you need to know this goes far beyond sports. It dominates academics too. Economists Kelly Bedard and Elizabeth Dewey studied the TIMSS assessment, a massive international math and science test given to fourth graders. They found the oldest fourth graders scored between 4 and 12 percentile points higher than the youngest kids in the same grade, purely because of the biological age advantage on test day. Now maybe you're thinking, so what? They score a little higher in fourth grade. They all graduate eventually. Here's how a small age gap in fourth grade permanently reshapes a kid's entire academic path. Academic tracking. A 4 to 12 percentile point gap is enormous because in most school systems, that exact gap is the metric used to decide who gets into the gifted program and who gets put in the standard track. Just like the hockey coach mistaking age for talent, the fourth grade teacher mistakes early cognitive maturity for innate genius. The older child gets placed in the advanced group. The advanced group gets harder material, more engaged teachers, a peer group of other high achievers. The younger child gets placed in the standard group and is quietly signaled that they simply aren't gifted. Fast forward 10 years, the child on the advanced track is taking AP calculus, while the younger child is still struggling through standard algebra. The system manufactured a genius by taking a temporary developmental gap and locking it into a permanent institutional label. And what makes this infuriating is how easy the fix would be. You could run youth hockey leagues split by birth quarter, January to March playing each other, October to December playing each other. Denmark actually does something close to this. There, academic ability tracking is banned until kids turn 10. They wait for the early maturity gap to fade naturally before separating the so-called smart kids from the so-called average ones. So why isn't this everywhere? Because adopting a system like that means giving up a cherished belief that success is a pure meritocracy. Admitting the Matthew effect is real means admitting our idols benefited from something completely arbitrary. If we admit the hockey system is rigged by a calendar, we have to admit that a lot of our heroes are, at least partly, the beneficiaries of a bureaucratic rounding error. But if the system gives that head start to the kid born in January, gets him onto the elite team, gets him more ice time, what happens next? He practices. Which brings us to the most famous and honestly the most misunderstood idea in this entire book, the 10,000 hour rule. If you've spent any time reading self-help blogs in the last 15 years, you've heard this repeated as gospel. To become a world-class expert at anything, chess, coding, violin, basketball, you supposedly just need 10,000 hours of practice. And Gladwell sells it with genuinely great stories. Before the Beatles invaded America in 1964, John, Paul, George and Ringo went to Hamburg, Germany, not to play stadiums, to play grimy strip clubs on the Reeperbahn. The club owners needed live music to keep people drinking all night, so the Beatles were contracted to play 8 hours a night, 7 days a week. You cannot survive that without getting tight as a band. By the time they had their breakthrough, they'd performed live together an estimated 1,200 times, more stage time than most modern bands rack up across an entire career. They hit their 10,000 hours, and it forged them into a juggernaut. Gladwell applies the same logic to tech billionaires. Bill Joy, the programming genius who co-founded Sun Microsystems, and Bill Gates. Joy happened to attend the University of Michigan in 1971, a critical year, because Michigan had just built one of the first time-sharing computer terminals in the world. Remember what computing looked like back then? You didn't open a laptop. You wrote code on physical punch cards, handed them to a technician, waited hours for the mainframe to process them, then got back a piece of paper telling you if your code even worked. Agonizingly slow. Time-sharing changed everything. Type directly into a terminal, get immediate feedback. Because Joy was at Michigan, he basically lived in the computer center, programming day and night, racking up his 10,000 hours before most people even knew what a computer was. Incredible story. But here's the part almost every other summary of this book skips entirely. Stop the story there and you'd walk away thinking the 10,000-hour rule is settled science. It is not. The scientific community went after this chapter hard, specifically Anders Ericsson, the Swedish psychologist who ran the original 1993 study on violinists at the Berlin Academy of Music, the exact study this whole rule is built on. Ericsson spent much of the rest of his career trying to unring the bell Gladwell rang. In writing for Yale's continuing education program, Ericsson stated plainly that Gladwell misconstrued his findings. The researcher who actually ran the study said the author got it wrong. What exactly did he get wrong? First, Ericsson never used the word rule, and he never claimed 10,000 was some magic universal threshold. In his study, the best violinists had averaged around 10,000 hours by age 20, but some reached elite status with 7,000, and some needed far more, and 10,000 hours wasn't even their finish line. It was roughly where they were just entering international competitions. They'd go on to practice thousands of additional hours to reach true mastery. So the number itself was never a threshold, it was an average. The bigger issue, the one that really frustrated Ericsson, was the definition of practice itself. Gladwell's framing made it sound like simply logging the hours was the key. Put your head down and grind. But Ericsson's entire career was built around the quality of practice, a concept he coined deliberate practice. Here's the difference. If you've played guitar in your garage for 10 years, you've probably logged 10,000 hours. You are not Eric Clapton. Why? Because playing guitar in your garage for a decade is usually just repeating what you already know how to do. Comfortable. Deliberate practice is the opposite. It's a highly structured, mentally exhausting process. You are constantly pushing just past your current ability, and crucially, you need immediate objective feedback, usually from an expert watching closely. Someone watching your hands and saying, "Your pinky is lifting a millimeter too high. Fix it." You build what Ericsson calls mental representations of the perfect performance and relentlessly compare your actual performance against that ideal. It's the difference between driving a car every day for 20 years and training to be a Formula One driver. 20 years of commuting doesn't make you a world-class racer because you're not deliberately practicing hairpin turns with a coach analyzing your braking distance down to the second. The academic pushback goes even further than Ericsson. Researcher Brooke McNamara led a massive meta-analysis reviewing over 9,000 studies on skill acquisition to measure how much deliberate practice actually matters. 9,331 papers, about as comprehensive as it gets. The results were humbling for anyone still clinging to the 10,000-hour myth. Even strict deliberate practice explained only 26% of the variance in performance for games like chess, 21% in music, 18% in sports, and less than 1% in professional careers. So deliberate practice matters, but it leaves 74% of what makes someone successful in a game completely unaccounted for. What is the other 74%? A combination of starting age, tying right back to the Matthew effect, genetic baseline, working memory capacity, the quality of the coaching, and most importantly, the infrastructural opportunity to practice in the first place. And here's where Gladwell deserves real credit. Even though the catchy chapter title turned into a pop culture myth that outgrew the actual science, what he got right is that missing 74%. The core theme of the book still holds. None of these people did it alone. Look back at Bill Gates through that lens. If you've poured countless hours into your own craft and you aren't famous yet, look at what Gates actually had. He didn't just have grit. In 1968, when he was 13 years old, Bill Gates attended Lakeside, a private high school in Seattle. That year, the Mothers Club at the school ran a rummage sale and used the proceeds to buy a teletype terminal connected to a mainframe computer in downtown Seattle. It's hard to overstate how rare that was. Almost no teenager on the planet, and frankly very few university researchers, had access to a time-sharing computer terminal in 1968. You couldn't buy that kind of access in most cities, let alone stumble into it in your 8th grade classroom. So the hours Gates put in were completely real. He snuck out of his house at 3 in the morning to use the computers at the University of Washington. He worked with a ferocity that is genuinely impressive. But the opportunity to log those hours in the first place was entirely unearned. It was a staggering infrastructural anomaly, luck, timing, a system somebody else built and paid for. You can have all the grit and deliberate practice in the world, but if the Mothers Club doesn't buy that terminal, there is no Microsoft. Which brings us to the next pillar of success. If hard work depends this heavily on unearned opportunity, what about raw brain power? Surely, if you're just blindingly smart, you can overcome a lack of opportunity. That's the ultimate myth. The genius who scribbles a brilliant equation on a window and changes the world. Gladwell tackles this with one of the most fascinating and honestly heartbreaking longitudinal studies in the history of psychology, Lewis Terman's Termites. The year is 1921. Lewis Terman is a psychologist at Stanford University and a pioneer of the newly invented IQ test. Terman is convinced that raw intelligence is the single most important human trait, so he sets out to identify the brightest children in California and track them for the rest of their lives. The scale of the study is staggering. Terman's team tested roughly 250,000 elementary and high school students, whittling the top scores down to a cohort of 4,470 kids. He called them his termites. Every one of them had an IQ over 140, and some tested as high as 200. Terman believed he'd assembled the future elite, the next generation of Nobel laureates, Pulitzer winners, titans of industry. He thought he was looking at the future saviors of humanity. But as he followed these children into adulthood, reality set in, and it was quietly devastating to his entire worldview. A few of the termites did become successful lawyers or doctors, but the vast majority had remarkably ordinary careers. Postal workers, low-level civil servants, struggling bookkeepers. By Terman's own lofty standards, a surprising number were outright failures. None became the historical titans he'd predicted. And here's the part that makes you want to laugh and wince at the same time. Terman's team actually tested two elementary school kids named William Shockley and Luis Alvarez, looked at their scores, and rejected both from the study because their IQs weren't quite high enough to clear the 140 cutoff. Both of those rejected children went on to win Nobel Prizes in physics. Not one of the 4,470 actual termites ever won a Nobel. So how does someone with an IQ of 135 win a Nobel Prize, while someone with an IQ of 180 ends up working as a bookkeeper? It comes down to Gladwell's idea of the IQ threshold. Intelligence absolutely matters, but only up to a point. Once you hit an IQ of around 120, smart enough to handle complex university-level material, additional IQ points stop translating into any measurable, real-world advantage in career success, income, or impact. The analogy Gladwell uses is intelligence as height in basketball. You need to be tall to play in the NBA. At 5'6", it doesn't matter how hard you work, you're probably not making the league. You need to clear a threshold, say around 6 feet, just to get on the court. But once you're in the league, being taller doesn't automatically make you better. A player who's 6'8" isn't automatically superior to a player who's 6'6". Michael Jordan was 6'6", and he routinely dominated players half a foot taller than him, because past that height threshold, other things start to matter more. Court vision, speed, agility, shooting mechanics, leadership. In the realm of intelligence, past that threshold of around 121, what starts to matter more is creativity, resilience, and what psychologists call divergent thinking. Gladwell illustrates this with the divergence test. An IQ test is a convergence test. It asks something like, what's the next number in this sequence? One right answer, and your brain converges on it. A divergence test measures creativity. It asks you to think of as many uses as possible for a common object, say a brick. Give that test to someone with an off-the-charts analytical IQ, and you'll often get a very literal, converging answer. Build a wall with it, throw it through a window. But a highly creative person, who might have an IQ of 125 rather than 180, use it as a bed warmer, prop open a door with it, grind it into red dye, use it as a makeshift hammer. Real-world innovation, the kind that actually wins a Nobel Prize, requires seeing multiple possibilities, not just solving a rigid equation faster than everyone else. But the real gut punch of this section isn't about divergent thinking. It's about what happens when high intelligence collides with a hostile system. Christopher Langan. Langan's story is one of the most tragic illustrations of the limits of raw intellect in the entire book. Gladwell presents him as a man with an almost unbelievable IQ of 195. For comparison, Albert Einstein's IQ is estimated at around 150. Langan's processing power is practically beyond measurement, yet when Gladwell catches up with him for the book, Langan isn't a tenured professor at MIT. He isn't running a tech company. He spent his adult life working as a bouncer, a construction worker, and a horse rancher in rural Missouri. How does someone with a higher IQ than Einstein end up as a bouncer? The answer is his upbringing and his encounters with bureaucracy. Langan grew up in deep poverty, in a dysfunctional, sometimes abusive family, and despite his brilliance, he was completely isolated. When he finally made it to college, first Reed, then Montana State, he was derailed by almost comically small bureaucratic hurdles. In one instance, his mother missed the deadline to sign a financial aid form, and he lost his scholarship over a signature. In another, his car broke down, making it impossible to get to his early morning classes, so he asked to shift his schedule to the afternoon so he could hitchhike in. The administration said no. Rules were rules, so what did a man with an IQ of 195 do? Did he find some brilliant loophole? No. He dropped out, walked away from higher education entirely. He experienced the system as a rigid, arbitrary, hostile wall, and he had no idea how to talk his way around it, which sounds insane on the surface. A man who can do complex calculus in his head, and he can't figure out how to talk to an academic dean. But that's precisely the point. Analytical intelligence is not the same thing as what psychologist Robert Sternberg calls practical intelligence. Practical intelligence is procedural knowledge, knowing what to say, to whom, when to say it, and how to say it for maximum effect. It's reading a room, understanding the unwritten rules of a bureaucracy, and knowing how to get what you want from people in power. To really drive this home, the book contrasts Langan with another verified genius, J. Robert Oppenheimer, the physicist who led the Manhattan Project and built the atomic bomb. The contrast is almost absurd. Oppenheimer was also a certified genius. As a young student at Cambridge, he struggled with depression and anxiety and grew furious with his tutor, a man named Patrick Blackett. So Oppenheimer took an apple, laced it with poisonous chemicals from the lab, and left it on his tutor's desk. He committed, essentially, attempted murder against a faculty member. Pause and compare that. Langan's mother forgets to sign a form, and his academic career is over. Oppenheimer tries to poison his teacher. What happens to him? He doesn't go to prison. He isn't even expelled. The university finds out, and Oppenheimer is placed on probation on the condition that he see a psychiatrist in London. He talks his way out of an attempted murder charge. Later in life, despite a reputation as a difficult intellectual, with communist sympathies and zero administrative experience, he talks his way into being appointed director of the Manhattan Project, convincing some of the most hardened generals in America that he's the only man for the job. Oppenheimer possessed an almost astronomical level of practical intelligence. He knew exactly how to charm, negotiate, and bend authority to his will. Langan had none of it, through no fault of his own, which leads to the real question: where does practical intelligence come from? Are you born with a silver tongue, or is it taught? According to the sociological research Gladwell draws on, specifically the work of Annette Lareau, practical intelligence is almost entirely taught, and it's deeply correlated with social class and parenting style. Lareau studied how families from different economic backgrounds raise their kids. She found that wealthy and middle-class parents, much like Oppenheimer's, who raised him in an affluent Manhattan neighborhood, practice a highly structured style she calls concerted cultivation. It's the modern, mic-managed childhood: piano on Tuesday, travel soccer on Thursday, math tutoring on Saturday. But it's not just the schedule, it's how the parents communicate. They don't just issue commands, they reason with their kids. They encourage questions, and most importantly, they teach their children how to interact with institutions. Before a doctor's appointment, a middle-class parent will say, "Make sure you ask the doctor about that ache in your knee." They explicitly train the child to look adults in the eye, to shake hands, to treat authority figures not as masters, but as resources there to help them. They teach that rules are negotiable if you make a good enough case. They instill a deep sense of entitlement in the sociological sense, the right to be heard, the right to customize your own environment. Poorer families like Langan's tend to use a more hands-off approach, not because they love their kids any less, but because they see child development as a natural process that doesn't need engineering. They issue directives, and crucially, they teach deference to authority. If the teacher says you're wrong, you're wrong. You don't argue. You don't question the doctor. You don't argue with the principal. You certainly don't walk into a university dean's office and demand an exception. The tragic result is something psychologists call learned helplessness in the face of bureaucracy. Look at Langan, and you see real, immense loss. We lose brilliant minds. We lose potential Einsteins and Nobel laureates, not because they aren't smart enough, but because they happen to be born into a class that never taught them the hidden language of success. If Langan had been raised by Oppenheimer's parents, he would have walked into that financial aid office, charmed the secretary, demanded to speak to the director, and walked out with his scholarship reinstated. Instead, he packed his bags and became a bouncer. Terman's own study ultimately proved this. The geniuses who went on to real success almost universally came from wealthier families. Their communities supplied the practical intelligence, the safety nets, and the cultural capital that no IQ test can measure. So we've covered the outsized role of early opportunity and the hidden necessity of practical intelligence. But we can't ignore pure old-fashioned effort. Gladwell spends a significant stretch of the book on how cultural legacy shapes work ethic, tackling a very familiar stereotype. Why do East Asian students historically excel at mathematics? This is one of the most provocative arguments in the whole book. Gladwell argues mathematical excellence isn't about some innate genetic predisposition at all. He draws a direct historical line between a culture's success in math and the history of rice agriculture in East Asia. On the surface, farming and calculus seem to have nothing to do with each other. It comes down to the nature of the work itself. Western agriculture, historically centered on wheat or corn, plant it in spring, let the rain do most of the work, harvest in the fall. Through the winter, there's relatively little to do. Rice farming in a paddy is an entirely different animal. It demands an astonishing amount of grueling, precise, year-round labor. You have to build complex irrigation systems, level the fields perfectly, plant every single seedling by hand in the mud, continuously monitor water levels, and meticulously weed the paddy. It's estimated to take around 3,000 hours of labor a year. And here's the psychological key to the whole argument. There's a direct, visible correlation between the exact amount of effort a farmer puts into a rice paddy and the yield they get out of it. Weed a little better, monitor the water a little closer, and you get more rice. It's a perfect feedback loop for hard work, the kind Western farming, at the mercy of weather it can't control, never quite offers. There's also a linguistic advantage layered on top of this. The number and counting systems in Asian languages like Chinese, Japanese, and Korean are highly logical and regular compared to English. In English, we've got strange irregular words like 11 and 12, and we invert the order for 14. In Chinese, it's completely logical. 11 is literally 10-1, 12 is 10-2. 24 is 2-10-4. So when a child raised speaking one of these languages learns math, the structure of the language itself makes base 10 addition and fractions intuitive, while an English-speaking child is stuck memorizing arbitrary vocabulary. Combine that linguistic head start with a 1,000-year-old cultural legacy of intense, precise, persistent labor, and you get a culture primed for mathematics. Because advanced math isn't just about being smart, it's about having the sheer stamina to sit with a confusing problem for an hour without giving up. To back up this idea about stamina and work ethic, Gladwell brings in a study by sociologist Carl Alexander at Johns Hopkins University. Alexander wanted to find the root cause of the achievement gap between wealthy and poor kids in America, so he tracked test scores of students in Baltimore public schools over several years. The usual assumption is that poor kids fall behind because they attend underfunded schools with weaker teachers, or because their home lives are too chaotic for academics to be a priority. Alexander's data revealed something completely counterintuitive. When Alexander looked at test scores from September to June, the actual school year, he found poor kids were learning reading and math at exactly the same rate as wealthy kids. The schools were working, the teachers were doing their jobs. The gap didn't open up in the classroom, it opened up during the summer. When the school doors closed for 3 months, wealthy kids went to camps, visited museums, got new books from their parents, and kept learning. Poor kids, without access to any of that, actively regressed. Researchers call it the summer slide. Over the course of elementary school, these summer slides compound, just like the hockey advantage. By middle school, poor kids are massively behind, not because they can't learn, but because the American school year is too short to compensate for the gap in their home environments. Which brings Gladwell to the story of Marita, a 12-year-old girl in the Bronx attending a KIPP school, the Knowledge is Power program. KIPP schools were specifically designed to correct this accumulated disadvantage, but the way they correct it is intense. Marita's schedule is grueling. She wakes up at 5:45 in the morning. She's at school by 7:25. She stays until 5 in the evening, goes home, starts homework, and doesn't finish until 9 or 10 at night. She goes to school on Saturdays, and for a large chunk of the summer, Marita is essentially making what Gladwell calls a bargain, giving up her childhood, her weekends, her evenings, to work the hours of a corporate lawyer. The KIPP system works by extending the school year and the school day, manually generating the extra hours of academic opportunity that wealthy kids receive by default, just by growing up in the homes they grew up in. Here's where the book gets genuinely uncomfortable. Gladwell presents Marita's bargain as an inspiring testament to the power of hard work, and her resilience really is remarkable. But is it inspiring, or is it a quietly dystopian indictment of the whole system? We are asking a 12-year-old girl in the Bronx to work 12-hour days, sacrifice her sleep, and give up her childhood just to reach the baseline that a wealthy kid gets for free. That doesn't feel like a victory so much as a systemic failure wearing a success story as a costume. Why does the burden fall entirely on the 12-year-old to exhaust herself? It's a valid critique, and it leads straight into the biggest backlash Gladwell received for this book. Because while Marita's story is morally complicated, the following chapter on cultural legacies and airline crashes drew outright fury from academics and journalists. Gladwell devotes a chapter to the crash of Korean Air Flight 801, which flew into a hill in Guam in 1997. Gladwell leans on a metric called the Power Distance Index, which measures how much a culture respects and fears authority. He argues that high-power distance cultures, like Korea or Colombia, are more prone to cockpit miscommunication because subordinates use mitigated speech, hinting at a problem instead of stating it outright. He concludes that Korean Air's poor safety record in the 1990s came down to exactly this, a cultural legacy of deference causing fatal cockpit errors, and that their safety record only improved once Western consultants forced pilots to speak English and flattened the hierarchy. As compelling as that narrative is, Gladwell took a beating for this chapter. Critics, including the writers behind the blog Ask a Korean and the podcast If Books Could Kill, went after the analysis hard, essentially accusing Gladwell of culturalism, attributing the complex actions of individuals to a broad ethnic stereotype, which edges uncomfortably close to something much worse. And when you look at what got left out, the critics have a real point. To build the case that Korean Air was uniquely dangerous, Gladwell cited their crash statistic, but critics noted those statistics included planes shot down by Soviet anti-air missiles and planes targeted by North Korean terrorist bombings. Geopolitical acts of war and literal terrorism folded into a statistic meant to demonstrate pilot incompetence. Critics also allege Gladwell truncated the actual cockpit transcripts, presenting snippets that made the co-pilot look like he was timidly hinting at bad weather, while leaving out the blinding rain, the exhausted crew, and the malfunctioning radar equipment at the Guam airport that night. The critics didn't stop there. They circled back to the rice paddy and math chapter 2, arguing it rests on cherry-picked anthropology, and that pairing Asian people are naturally good at math with Asian people are mechanically deferential, and therefore bad at flying planes, is lazy analysis, dressed up as insight, and not a harmless kind of lazy either, which gives us a genuinely important takeaway. As consumers of information, we have to be careful with pseudo-intellectual storytelling. Gladwell is a phenomenal storyteller. He can make complex sociology feel like a thriller, but when you force the messy, chaotic reality of human behavior into a neat, highly digestible narrative about cultural legacy, you end up erasing vital context. It's a cautionary tale about the pull of the aha moment. We want a simple, unifying explanation for complicated things. It feels satisfying to say, They crashed because of their power distance index. But as the critics point out, leaning on broad cultural stereotypes to explain specific mechanical, meteorological, or human failures obscures the truth. Sometimes a crash is just terrible weather, an exhausted pilot, and a broken radar. Knowing the book carries these real flaws and blind spots, it's worth turning the lens on the author himself, because in the final chapter of Outliers, Gladwell does something unusual. He analyzes his own origin story, trying to explain how he, a biracial kid from Canada, became a multi-millionaire best-selling author. He traces it to his parents, his English mathematician father Graham, and his Jamaican mother Joyce. Joyce Gladwell is a descendant of enslaved Africans in Jamaica, a brilliant, ambitious woman who eventually earned a scholarship to University College London, where she met Graham. Gladwell acknowledges his mother's fierce intelligence, but applies the exact thesis of this book to her life and looks for the hidden web of advantages behind it. He finds that a specific traumatic act in 18th century Jamaica inadvertently spared her descendants from lethal labor due to rampant colorism. That tiny sliver of privilege cascaded through generations, directly paving the way for Joyce Gladwell to attend a good school in Jamaica, which positioned her to win a rare scholarship to London, which let her meet a mathematician, move to Canada, and raise a son in a household of high academic expectation. Gladwell writes one particularly striking line near the end of the book. Outliers wasn't intended as autobiography, but you could read it as an extended apology for his own success. It's a rare admission. You almost never see a wildly successful person publicly take apart their own myth. He explicitly admits his privileged position rests on a foundation of historical accident, the brutal reality of colonialism, serendipitous timing, and sheer luck. He strips away the illusion that he earned his success purely through his own cleverness. Bringing all of this together, after the hockey players, the 10,000 hours, the termites, the rice paddies, and the plane crashes, what's the final verdict on Outliers? One of the most common critiques is that the entire book suffers from survivorship bias. Gladwell looks at the people who made it through the gauntlet, the billionaires, the rock stars, draws a bullseye around them, and calls what they did the formula for success. But you can't just study the winners to figure out the rules of the game. You have to look at the people who did the exact same things and simply didn't get lucky. Even so, despite the cherry-picked data, the survivorship bias and the oversimplified rules, the academic community still finds real value in the core thesis. A review in the Journal of Scientific Psychology praised the book for illustrating what's called the biopsychosocial model of success. It holds that human outcomes are the result of three overlapping spheres: biology, genetics, sociology, environment/class, and psychology, internal drive, resilience. Success requires a genuinely lucky intersection of all three. So why does this book matter so much, even with all its flaws? Because it takes a sledgehammer to the myth of the self-made man who pulled himself up by nothing but his own bootstraps. That myth is worth destroying, because it's quietly toxic. It's toxic because of its inverse. If we believe success is purely a matter of individual merit and hard work, we're forced to believe that failure is purely a matter of laziness or stupidity. When we buy into a myth of pure meritocracy, we write off the hockey player born in December as someone who just didn't want it enough. But as this episode has shown, the machinery of achievement is shaped heavily by factors entirely outside any individual's control. So what does this mean for you? It means recognizing that success is an incredibly fragile ecosystem. The next time you look at a highly successful person, don't just marvel at their grit or their genius. Look at the scaffolding holding them up, their birth year, their parents' vocabulary, their zip code, and the infrastructure they happen to have access to. And more importantly, look at yourself the exact same way. Give yourself some grace. Some of the walls you face are pure sociology, entirely outside your control. And at the same time, take a moment to notice the invisible tailwinds, the lucky breaks, the right place, right time moments that got you here too. One last puzzle to leave you with. This whole episode has been about criticizing systems that arbitrarily punish people. But imagine a world engineered to be perfectly fair. Would we risk creating something oddly sterile? How much of the ferocious drive that creates a true outlier is actually forged in the friction of pushing back against the very systemic flaws this whole episode just spent an hour criticizing? Are the hurdles the thing that builds the champion? Remove the friction, and do you remove the spark too? What we're actually looking at is a landscape far messier, far more unfair, and in the end, far more fascinating than any of us really want to admit.